Okay, go ahead and find a seat and we'll get started. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to have so many faculty members, so many colleagues here, so many students here. It's great to have friends from Washington, friends from Texas, friends from New York. Everyone is coming to the heartland of the United States to hear the talks over the next couple of days. I am Dr. Baxter, the director for the Center for Beauty and Culture and the Angelico Fellowship. The Center for Beauty and Culture exists to study beauty in all of its possible manifestations. Just as a college of science at a university, you'd find departments dedicated to studying the world at the microscopic level, molecular biology, or the submicroscopic level, particle physics, and others studying the world as it unfolds in the telescopic scale like astrophysics, or over eons like cosmology and geology. Just so does the Center for Beauty and Culture attend to the whole scale of beauty. Beauty is manifested in the visual arts, beauty is manifested in music, beauty is manifested within the natural world, and beauty is manifested within the human heart. We're also interested in why beauty fails to manifest itself in our contemporary culture, and why it's so difficult for our contemporary culture to feel that as a loss. In this way, we take our cue from St. Augustine, who said once, "And what is this God? I asked the earth, and it answered, I am not he. And all things that are in the earth made the same confession. I asked the sea and the deep and the creeping things, and they answered, we are not your God, seek higher. I asked the winds that blow the whole air with all that is in it answered, I am not God. I asked the heavens, the sun, the moon, the stars, and they answered, neither are we the God whom you seek. And I said to all the things that throng about the gateways of my senses, tell me of my God. And they cried out in a great voice, he made us. My question was my gazing upon them, and their answer was their beauty." When you keep all of this in mind, you can begin to understand why we awarded the prize for excellence in theology and the arts to Bishop Barron a couple years ago, a theologian who cares about beauty. Why we awarded it to the Florentine sculptor Cody Swanson and to the Scottish composer James Macmillan. But you can also understand why we want to give this award to Dr. Glenn Arbery, a South Carolina-born, Georgia-raised poet turned literary critic who now lives in Wyoming. Like all of us at the Center for Beauty and Culture, Dr. Glenn has wide-ranging interest. His first literary love was lyric poetry, and as of this fall, he's just published the third novel in his trilogy. As his wife, Dr. Virginia Arbery, put it to me recently, I thought I married a poet, and it turns out he's a novelist. Still, that feels like a pretty good deal to me, right? Dr. Glenn is professor of humanities at Wyoming Catholic College, where he and Dr. Virginia are caretakers of an encyclopedic list of literary, historical, and philosophical texts. In any given year, Dr. Glenn and Dr. Virginia will teach Homer's Iliad, Dante's Comedy, hopefully in the right translation, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, Melville's Moby Dick, and loads of Faulkner, Plato, Sophocles, Shakespeare, Keats, and Milton. I think Dr. Glenn is the best read man I know. Maybe the best man too, right? But he doesn't just read, he studies, because he believes that the world is as wide as the soul is deep, and that we need all the keys on the piano to sound those depths. It's for this reason that we're blessed, lucky, happy, and tickled, as you might say in the Georgian vernacular, that Dr. Glenn, over the next couple of days, is going to give us a holistic introduction to the range, scope, and power of the literary imagination. But it all starts with lyric poetry as disclosure.
Thank you so much, Jason. I don't know that I'm the most well-read man you know. I think you are, but in any case, it is a great privilege for me to be here and great pleasure to be here at Benedictine College. I'm really taken with the beauty of this campus. In fact, my wife and I were saying earlier today that I think we have campus envy. You know, Wyoming Catholic is sort of right in the middle of a little town in the west, but Benedictine, with its great situation on the Missouri River is really something, and you're very lucky to be here. So greetings from Wyoming Catholic College and from the Wind River Mountains and Little Lander. I plan over the next few days, as Dr. Baxter said, to be talking about literary genre. This is a way of understanding the literary universe. And I'm going to be paying homage at the same time to our great teacher at the University of Dallas, Louise Cowan, whose work has helped illuminate a new system of, well, a new way of studying literature for countless students over the past 2 or 3 generations. Louise didn't invent a new system of classification, but she took the 4 major kinds of literature from Aristotle and the Poetics and thought deeply into them. And my wife and I were part of the school of thought that developed among friends at UD and afterwards at the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture that issued in 4 volumes, starting in 1984 with The Terrain of Comedy, Epic Cosmos in 1992, Tragic Abyss in 2003, which I edited, and then The Prospect of Lyric, which Baynard Cowan edited in 2012, excuse me, just 3 years before Louise's death, 10 years ago in 2015. I recommend The Prospect of Lyric for anyone wanting to pursue the idea of lyric in its full range and depth. What I'm going to be doing this evening is exploring one aspect of lyric poetry, what it discloses, what it opens up in the ordinary world. And I'm going to get there indirectly. Back in 2014, my wife and I bought a house on 6 acres of land, several miles west of Lander, Wyoming. Squaw Creek, a tributary of the Poposia River, forms the valley between our house, which rests on the western bluff, and the brick-red scarp of sandstone several hundred yards to the east. Getting down to the creek bottom requires a significant descent. And over the years, we've beaten a path of 100 yards or so that angles down past sagebrush and chokecherry trees and junipers before turning back more steeply to a clearing where we dug a fire pit in the summer of 2014. For the first 5 or 6 years that we owned that property, we could never see the course of the creek because the whole bottom was densely overgrown with thickets. And the bridge that the previous owners had built washed away in a spring flood a year or 2 after we moved in. So even getting to the other side of the creek became a kind of project. About 5 years ago, with a little time at home granted by the pandemic, I began to get serious about clearing the banks of the creek. I hired a man to cut some of the worst overgrowth, and then I built 4 simple bridges that I could move in case of another flood. As I began what became a years-long labor, my wife would call it an obsession, I learned the names of the trees and the shrubs that grew along the creek and obscured it. Red willow, golden willow, red osier dogwood, buffalo berry, hawthorn, water birch, golden currant. Everything that crowded up to the water had a bottom half of dead branches, and new limbs intertwined with these stiff dead ones. Clearing beside the creek meant cutting out decades of this stiff, gray, splintering stuff that wanted blood and usually got it. And just as bad was clearing the bed of the creek itself. I would have to wade in thigh deep to cut loose these fallen limbs that were years deep beneath the water and heave up onto the bank these sunken things that were so waterlogged they were like stone. But what's happened month by month, year by year, is that the creek has begun to find itself and remember the sign, so to speak. the feel of light on the skin of the water. And we've begun to see the flow and turn of that lovely current that comes down from the Wind River Mountains and cuts through the foothills to the west of us. It's a labor that has become for me a metaphor for lyric poetry itself, or more precisely, the labor of getting back to some essential insight. Lyric as disclosure, lyric as the recovery of this shining, this boon of God. So what do I mean by disclosure? I have to confess to a summer spent not just clearing the creek, but also wrestling with phenomenology more seriously and systematically than I've done before. I don't propose to turn philosopher at my age, don't worry, Ed. But ever since I was in my early 20s, I found phenomenology to be the most appealing philosophic approach to literature. 50 years ago, I used Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space in my master's thesis at the University of Georgia. And at various times since then, I've drawn from Georges Poulet, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Paul Ricoeur. I've taught essays from Heidegger's Poetry, Language, and Thought since the 1980s. But what I found the phenomenologists describing was similar to what John Crow Ransom, the Southern critic, the leader of the fugitive agrarians, called the primary power of the poet. The faculty of presenting images so whole and clean that they resist the catalysis of thought. Ransom describes what Jean-Luc Marion, another phenomenologist, will later call a saturated phenomenon. I'll talk about this more tomorrow night, but it's an experience that exceeds the capacity of a concept to constitute it. In his introduction to phenomenology, which I read over the summer, Father Robert Sokolowski distinguishes between the truth of correctness and the truth of disclosure. Correctness has to do with the accuracy of statements or propositions that can be proved or disproved with evidence. For example, suppose I say that the town of Atchison is on the Mississippi River. This is a statement, in this case incorrect, since Atchison is on the Missouri River. By contrast, the truth of disclosure is the manifestation or display of a state of affairs that simply comes before the mind, like the Missouri itself, say from the balcony down the hall. It's simply disclosed, like what you see when you round a curve in the mountains and find a valley open up before you. Or what appears when a janitor turns on the lights in a gymnasium on the morning after a basketball game. Or what a mother sees or smells when she opens the door to a teenager's room. Disclosure is not merely sense experience, though, because we sense things all the time inattentively. In disclosure, there's always an element of unconcealing, with something coming out of the unseen into the visible, an element of revealing. Martin Heidegger claims that this fundamental meaning of unconcealment underlies the Greek word for truth, aletheia. And for the French phenomenologist Marion, whom I've already mentioned, even the realm of the visible, the things we can see, has this element of disclosure in it. Because out of all the ceaselessly incoming tide of everything that presents itself to sight, the look, the act of attention is drawn to some one particular thing. Why do people take so much trouble to wrap gifts, say on birthdays or Christmas? Because unwrapping them allows the truth of disclosure. It's not just a thing, it's this thing revealed in its givenness, its character of being bestowed. It's not just a sweater or a book or a necklace, but something enhanced as a gift and so received in the consciousness that someone else gave their affectionate attention to exactly this thing just for you. The truth of disclosure has this aura of gift, especially in poetry, where the perception or display comes through the poet's language. So I'm reminded of Ezra Pound's poem, Anastasia of the Metro. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. That's the whole poem. Famous, easy to memorize, you know. Some students think it's a joke. But suppose that Pound had written, the appearance of these faces in the crowd is like seeing flowers on a single branch. Nothing. What is it that the word apparition brings with it? An apparition is something beyond the ordinary power of the eyes, more than natural, perhaps ghostly. In the first act of Hamlet, the ghost of the old king is described as an apparition. Or perhaps it's divine. We speak of apparitions of the Virgin Mary. The apparition, then, of extraordinary faces in a crowd of ordinary people on a rainy day in the subway in Paris. These faces, beautiful, unexpected, even holy. But why would we remember them? Then in a flash comes the metaphor that transforms them and reveals them and seals them in our recollection. Petals on a wet black bough. Not flowers, petals. Petals, pale, finely textured, all of a color on a single bough in a single moment. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. If we try to ransack the poem for meaning, what do the petals stand for? What is Pound trying to say about modern urban life? We miss the simple beauty of disclosure. Pound avoids anything that could be taken as a truth of correctness, not even providing a complete sentence or predication, unlike William Carlos Williams in his equally famous Images poem that also scandalizes students, The Red Wheelbarrow. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. William does make a statement about the red wheelbarrow, and we could test it for correctness. But the point is that we wouldn't come to the image without being told how much depends on it. So much. I've wondered if Williams was influenced by phenomenology or simply thinking in the same way. His famous saying, "No ideas but in things," closely resembles Husserl's dictum, "back to the things themselves." Robert Frost's short poem, Dust of Snow, is another example of a poem as a simple disclosure, this time without even a metaphor. But next to Pound and Williams, it seems almost like a discourse. The way a crow shook down on me, the dust of snow from a hemlock tree, has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. And here the focus is on the emotional state of the poet. Before this dust of snow cascaded down on him, he had rued the day. We're familiar with the word in this sense. You will rue the day when you trust his advice, or buy that stock, or speak to that woman. The poet has already rued the day, which means he's bitterly written it off. So why the change in mood? The poem wouldn't work if the bird were, say, a robin or a cardinal. I mean, not just the stanza. The way a cardinal, no. What would they be doing there in the snow anyway? It has to be a crow. It has to be a hemlock tree with its verbal echo of Socrates, deadly hemlock, but also the word hemlock, these hints of being hemmed in, locked up. And it has to be a dust of snow with its reminder of dust to dust. We can reconstruct things from the associations of the words and the winter scene. But what's really going on is the way the crow, I don't know how you pictured this crow. I picture him with a kind of piratical insouciance, you know. The way the crow shakes the snow on the poet and brings him to a halt, the halt which comes in the pause between the two stanzas, right? The way a crow sits down, and you get that pause and the white space between the two stanzas. The dust of snow right there. When he walks on, the poet, the trickster in the tree, has freed the poet from moping. Not permanently, but for part of a bad day. Maybe just long enough to give him the poem we're reading a century later. In speaking of lyric as disclosure, I'm really talking about the fundamental way that literature works as a mode of knowledge. It doesn't reason so much as it shows. Not that it's without an argument of sorts or an emotional logic, but in my estimation, lyric poetry is the most intense kind of disclosure. Louise Cowan claims that the lyric realm is the place of origins and sources, the land of heart's desire, symbolized by the garden. By the garden, she means Eden, that archetype of gardens, whose mood and intensity lyric poetry evokes. The wholeness of love, the union, both sexual and mystical, of the Song of Songs is one of its manifestations. Awake, O north wind, and come, O south wind, blow upon my garden. Let its fragrance be wafted abroad. Let my beloved come to his garden and eat its choicest fruits. She divides lyric into three moments, all related to the beloved object: anticipation of its coming, consummation in its presence, and lamentation in its absence, desire, fulfillment, and loss. This description seems primarily to apply to love poetry itself, like Sappho's or Petrarch's, or Sir Philip Sidney's in his Astrophil and Stella sonnet sequence, or John Donne in the canonization or the ecstasy. Love poetry might even be addressed to God, as the Psalms are, full of anticipation, consummation, lamentation. Such poetry reveals a state of desire or joy or desolation with respect to the beloved. But in modernity, and here I'm going to be trashing modernity, no, I'm not. In modernity, lyric poetry changed its focus from the beloved to the truth of disclosure itself. The novelist Milan Kundera, writing about Cervantes, author of Don Quixote, says that the roots of the modern crisis for Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, lay for him at the beginning of the modern era in Galileo and Descartes, and the one-sided nature of the European sciences, which reduced the world to a mere object of technical and mathematical investigation, and put the concrete world of life, the Lebenswelt as he called it, beyond their horizon. For Kundera, the rise of the novel in modernity has helped restore man's concrete being, his world of life, in a way that counters or redresses the abstracting character of the sciences. But the same is arguably true of lyric poetry, especially beginning with the Romantics. Long before Husserl and other phenomenologists began their work, lyric poetry seized upon perceptual experience of the natural world as its primary subject matter, what Jacques Maritain calls that intercommunication between the inner being of things and the inner being of the human self, which is a kind of divination. I don't mean to be absolute about this turn, but let me contrast two poems, Edmund Waller's Go Lovely Rose and William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. Waller's song, written sometime in the early 1640s, appeals to the beloved through a symbol, the rose, whose budding, blossoming, and death encapsulate all the phases of lyric in Cowan's sense. Like Marvell's to his coy mistress, or Herrick's to the virgins to make much of time, the poem urges the beloved not to delay, and the argument is the rose itself. First, it would show the beloved that she resembles the rose, whose beauty would be worthless if it were not seen, just as hers will be worthless if it does not respond to love. She must come forth now to let herself be seen, because beauty like hers exists only briefly before it dies. Now from this ungainly paraphrase to the precision of the poem. Go, lovely rose, tell her that waste her time and me, that now she knows, when I resemble her to thee, how sweet and fair she seems to be. Tell her that's young, and shuns to have her graces spied, that hadst thou sprung in deserts where no men abide, thou must have uncommended died. Small is the worth of beauty from the light retired. Bid her come forth, suffer herself to be desired, and not blush so to be admired. Then die, that she, the common fate of all things rare, may read in thee how small a part of time they share that are so wondrous, sweet, and fair. As I said before, the argument of the poem is the rose itself. Or is it a rose, or the rose as symbol? The poem doesn't reveal a particular rose, and it has no interest in doing so. Its argument is about letting beauty appear. I would suggest that the poem also has no real interest in a particular beloved with a name and address, or a phone number. The beloved exists like the rose only for the sake of the poem. A beautiful girl being urged to come forth into time and to reveal her beauty and suffer the dangerous magic of desire. Both rose and girl are figures in the poem's fresh deployment of conventions, disclosing the general truth that all things rare have the common fate of death. The word waste in the first stanza, tell her that waste her time and me, at first sounds casual, but waste becomes a terrible word from the perspective of the last stanza, because it names her thoughtless participation in universal destruction. The lover already feels it in himself as his beloved wastes him, almost in the contemporary informal sense. But nowhere in this poem, so perfect in its form, do we sense that the poet's primary concern is with a particular young woman or with the givenness of the natural world so much as with a literary trope perfectly realized. Now, by contrast, let's consider Wordsworth, whose famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, describes a day interrupted by a sudden vision. All at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. This scene, which overwhelms the poet, is more intense because entirely unexpected. It becomes the work of the poet to make these daffodils fill the whole imagination of the reader, and at the same time domesticate the scene, normalizing it by explaining how this show, his word, made him feel. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company. He further explains what wealth this show has brought him. For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. Here's not so much the original experience he tries to capture as that flash of recollection that comes back instantaneously and unbidden. Yet, what was given in that original disclosure is crucially important. Its unexpectedness, its givenness, which marks a kind of grace in nature itself. He works to make the poem manifest this experience and inflect it emotionally in the bliss of solitude of a reader far removed from his own space and time. The reader needs to experience that flash upon the inward eye of the imagination. Unlike Waller's rose, the daffodils per se matter, not as the literary symbol of something else, but as a particular perception, a disclosure that amounts to revelation. I don't think you see the same kind of thing before you get to a certain stage like in romantic poetry. But what does that mean? Why call it revelation? In fact, why do I look at Wordsworth, say, instead of turning to Gerard Manley Hopkins, whose poems are explicitly about the relation of the natural world to the Creator, as in God's grandeur? The world is charged with the grandeur of God, or pied beauty, which ends, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. Or a Starlight Night, another one I love. But my question is whether, in an increasingly secular and technological world, lyric itself has a revelatory nature. Can it open something interior, as prayer does, and bring us out of overgrown habit, out of our clutter of dead language, and into a baptized, Edenic relation to the given world? The New England poet Richard Wilbur shows how it might be done. In his poem, Mayflies, he describes a walk that frost might have taken. In somber forest, when the sun was low, I saw from unseen pools a mist of flies in their quadrillions rise and animate a ragged patch of glow with sudden glittering as when a crowd of stars appear through a brief gap in black and driven cloud, one arc of their great round dance showing clear. I hope you get that image. He's walking through the woods, there's a beam of sunlight, and right in there somewhere are these mayflies, right? You've seen them just sort of going up and down, millions of them in one little spot of sunlight. It was no muddled swarm I witnessed, for in entrechat each fluttering insect there rose 2 steep yards in air, then slowly floated down to climb once more, so that they all composed a manifold and figured scene, and seemed the weavers of some cloth of gold, or the fine pistons of some bright machine. Watching those lifelong dancers of a day, love that line, these things live one day, right? Watching those lifelong dancers of a day, as night closed in, I felt myself alone in a life too much my own, more mortal in my separateness than they. Unless, I thought, I had been called to be not fly or star, but one whose task is joyfully to see how fair the fiats of the caller are. This glimpse of the mayflies deep in the forest, illuminated by a late sunbeam, reminds the poet of seeing an arc of the night sky through the clouds. The brief existence of the insects becomes metaphorically the round dance of the constellations, an image that the ancients understood as the eternal heavenly order. In thinking about this paradoxical similarity between the stars and the mayflies, Wilbur takes occasion to look at the mayflies even more closely, this time seeing them in terms of art or technique, craft, and design. He doesn't see mindless randomness, in other words, but a ballet, a golden weave, the pistons of some bright machine in which this apparent randomness coalesces into an order that Dante might use in a simile in the Paradiso, a poem much on my mind these days. But the poem culminates in Wilbur's reflection on his own calling as a poet. Let me read it again. Watching these lifelong dancers of a day, as night closed in, I felt myself alone in a life too much my own, more mortal in my separateness than they. Unless, I thought, I had been called to be not fly or star, but one whose task is joyfully to see how fair the fiats of the caller are. Like frost and dust of snow, he undergoes a change of mood from loneliness and separation to the possibility of joy. Not fly or star, but one whose task is joyfully to see how fair the fiats of the caller are. What are the fiats of the caller? A fiat is a decree, a let it be done, and the fiats of God are creation itself. Mary also voices her fiat mihi, an echo of the creation. But specifically, the call to the poet is to see how fair this is, how just, but also in the older sense of the word, how beautiful creation is. And not just to see it, but to witness to it joyfully by making it appear in its givenness. Beauty revealed like this is the poem simply given, not earned. And both the poet and the reader feel in it for an instant the givenness beneath what we are and everything that we experience. I think about the difference between this kind of immediate, unsought revelation and the labor of clearing the creek that started this whole meditation. It seems wrong to say that a gift can be the result of hard labor. But that's surely part of the paradox of lyric as disclosure, the smile of the beloved after the effort of wooing. No poem like Mayflies comes to someone inattentive to insight or unpracticed in language. But the problem of the lyric poet comes from the nature of language. As the critic and poet T.E. Hume put it, language by its very nature is a communal thing. That is, it expresses never the exact thing, but a compromise, that which is common to you, to me, and everybody. And to get out clearly and exactly what the poet does see, he must have a terrific struggle with language. What is that? Why is that? Because language consists of many dead metaphors, and it tends toward communal abstraction. For Hume, lyric poetry tries to prevent you from gliding through an abstract process. It chooses fresh epithets and fresh metaphors, not so much because they're new, as we're tired of the old, but because the old ceased to convey a physical thing and became abstract counters. These abstract counters resemble what phenomenologists call sedimentation, which means the falling back into vagueness and obscurity of the original ideas on which current understandings are based. Father Sokolowski gives the example of theater. which is now taken for granted, even though it was originally generated as a specific kind of depiction and articulation. The same could be said of writing or even of human language, because with its syntactic structure. Sedimentation is always at odds with the truth of disclosure. We get used to things. We no longer feel things once felt or think things once thought. Clearing Squaw Creek feels like what Father Soskolowski describes as the attempt to get back to the essentials of things, which also means getting to the archaic and original. How do we get back to the original? To some garden experience at the root of imagination. It's interesting to think when the nouns garden and landscape became verbs, to garden, to landscape, which means working with nature to disclose a kind of lyric fluency. When we're talking about reading lyric poetry, it can also be a matter of working through a sedimentation of readings to the original live experience of disclosure. For example, reading Keats's metaphor of the European explorers on a peak in Darien or Panama, silently looking at each other. You know this poem? It's Keats's Chapman's Homer, right? He's comparing these explorers in America. First, the guy who first discovers the new planet, but then the discovers in America and Panama. He thinks it's Cortez, it's actually blah, blah. But anyway, they're up on the peak in Darien, and they're looking out at the Pacific Ocean for the first time. They didn't suspect there was a Pacific Ocean. And so they're looking at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. So if we feel that, if we just get used to the poem, we no longer feel the kind of impact of what Keats is getting at here, we'll also miss what he's doing with this as a metaphor. Reading the poem means feeling their astonishment, powerful as it is, but also reading that shock of the image as Keats's experience in first discovering Homer, what it's like to read Homer for the first time and to sense that the immense world that he's able to access through Chapman's translation for the first time. So how do we see again what we're used to seeing? Working in the creek, I often think of the English poet Ted Hughes because of his 1983 volume of poems, River. In the poem that begins the volume, which is written in three-lined, unrhymed stanzas, here's what he writes. From a core flash, from a thunder silence, inside the sun, the smelting crawls and glimmers among heather-topped stones. And it takes a minute to take in that image. If we imagine the interior of the sun as a nuclear furnace, a core flash beyond sight and hearing, then the smelting that flows from this unimaginable heat should be some incandescent molten metal. But miraculously, mercifully, it is instead the river, this cool water that crawls and glimmers among heather-topped stones. It's an astonishing disclosure. The mill of the galaxy, the generator making the atoms dance with its reverberations, brims out lowly for cattle to wade. At the same time that Hughes asks us to see the river's source in the sun itself, which is true in the sense of correctness over countless intermediate steps, he also makes us see something, if we're attentive to the suggestive, to the revelatory suggestion, he makes us see something about the incarnation, which brims out of the Godhead to enter a world in so lowly a form that cattle can wade the river as they once stirred around Christ in the manger. Hughes calls the poem Flesh of Light, as though to echo God from God, light from light in the Nicene Creed. Later in the book, he picks up this startling identification again. The title, River, is also the subject of the sentence with which the poem begins. River, fallen from heaven, lies across the lap of his mother, broken by world. But water will go on, issuing from heaven, in dumbness uttering spirit brightness through its broken mouth. Scattered in a million pieces and buried, its dry tombs will split at a sign in the sky. At a rending of veils, it will rise, and a time after times. After swallowing death in the pit, it will return stainless for the delivery of this world. So the river is a god, knee-deep among reeds, watching men, or hung by the heels down the door of a dam. It is a god and inviolable, immortal, and will wash itself of all deaths. This is simply what the word river means, what a river is. And from the first disclosure, there's a pathos. River, fallen from heaven, lies across the lap of his mother, broken by world. River is Michelangelo's Pietà, and Mary is earth itself, gay, Gaia. And here is the passivity of Christ's body deposed from the cross, broken by world. World here in the sense of civilization, commerce, conquest, all the constructs of man's enterprise and pride and sin. The world that Wordsworth evokes when he writes that the world is too much with us. This is river, fouled by waste, hung by the heels down the door of a dam, exploited for energy, like the Rhine and Heidegger's essay concerning technology. But for all that, still uttering spirit brightness from its broken mouth. River reveals Christ as though his baptism in the River Jordan, which announces the beginning of his public ministry, were at the same time a revelation that he is the river from which he rises, inviolable, immortal. He will wash himself, and therefore us, of all deaths. Regardless of what foulness and willfulness we empty into river, it will rise, and a time after times, after swallowing death in the pit, it will return stainless for the delivery of this world. River is baptismal, resurrectional. Is it some such hope that keeps drawing me down to the creek? Working on it feels purgatorial, I admit, as though the recovery of the living water were at least a hint of the promise of Eden in the flesh of light, the disclosure of lyric. In a way, this whole understanding of lyric is naive, of course. Just the other day, I found a note I'd written over 10 years ago about how I wanted a sense of the veil of familiarity being stripped from existent things so that they shine, these terms and ideas already 30 years old in my imagination. Well, they're even older than that now, right? But I also wonder if the lyric doesn't ultimately want more than the garden, this brief disclosure of Eden and the Edenic loss. I wonder if there's also a kind of foretaste implicit in the lyric. In other words, not simply the recollection of Eden, but the anticipation of paradise. In Canto 30 of Paradiso, Dante uses two images that draw together much of what I've been trying to get at about lyric as disclosure. The first comes when Dante's sight clears so much beyond its previous powers that as he writes, I saw light that took a river's form, light flashing, reddish gold between two banks, painted with wonderful spring flowerings. Out of that stream there issued living sparks, which settled on the flowers on all sides like rubies set in gold. And then, as if intoxicated with the odors, they again plunged into the amazing flood. As one spark sank, another spark emerged. In effect, the pilgrim undergoes disclosure after disclosure. In order to perfect his sight, he leans to the river at Beatrice's instructions and bathes his eyes in its waters, and at once the river resolves into the great circle of the celestial rose. The flow of being, the historical motion of revelation and time, the flesh of light, once broken by world and now washed of all deaths, now reveals itself as one simple blossom, as particular as Pound's faces, as surprising as Wordsworth's daffodils, as deep with all symbolism as Waller's rose. Ultimately, writes Louise Cowan, the lyric reveals the secret at the heart of poetry. That's why I keep going back to the creek, because the secret is worth the labor. Thank you.